So what I'd like to do is introduce Nick Virts. He is our labor relations representative who's going to start the presentation on performance evaluations. So please welcome Nick Virts.
Hello. Can everybody read that? Anybody in the back?
Yeah, I can read it from here.
Not everybody has vision like yours, Don. Sure. So Diego mentioned the renewal form, and we talked about it afterwards, but I just wanted to do a 60-second explanation of that because some people have said, what the heck? I'm already a member. Why do I have to renew? I've never had to renew in the past. And in addition to that, there's also a sheet that was at the front table. Some of you have these, AB 1231. I'll give you a 30-second spiel on that. In our last contract bargaining, one of the things that we proposed was restoring a salary step compensation system here at the CSU, not just here, but throughout the state, which would address the inherent unfairness in the range compensation system. We all know of folks that maybe have been here for quite a while and are making the same or even less than more newly hired employees doing the same job. With the range system, that is problematic. And even if you do a one-time adjustment, it just, because of recruitment and retention and the economy, it constantly has to be, it's a broken system. It's flawed from its get-go. So we did not win that in contract bargaining. What we're going for it in the state legislature. CSU is the only public employer in the state of California, the only state employer that does not have a step system. By step, I mean as you gain years of service with the institution, you automatically move up the salary steps, right? So there's a step for a classification at 1 year, at 5 years, at 10 years, and so on, right? Kind of guarantees movement. A lot of times we have what we call the longevity penalty, right? The longer you're here, the more undercompensated you are. So good news is that has been working its way through the legislature. It passed the assembly. It passed through a few of the Senate committees last week. If all goes well, it'll be heading to the governor in the next couple weeks, and that will be the big lift to getting Governor Brown to sign that into law. So that's some information on that. We may call upon you in the next couple weeks to send off an email to the governor or make a phone call, right? So getting back to the renewal form. Renewal form, very quickly, we are facing, I don't know if anybody has heard in the news about a Supreme Court decision, Janus versus AFSCME. Anybody heard about that? Essentially, the Supreme Court will be deciding very soon, maybe even next week, on the fate of what's called fair share fees in the state of California. If you are working for a public employer, you don't have to join the union, but you have to pay your fair share, right? Because you have the same representation. You can hold the union legally accountable for representation. You get the benefits of the contract. So you pay a slightly smaller amount as a fair share fee. There's a case that could take that away, but could go beyond that in terms of affecting membership and maintenance of membership. It's kind of wonky and complicated, but this new form essentially is if you're a member already, we would want to have you renew or recommit because of the potential legal challenges that may come from the Supreme Court decision. And I can answer questions if that is all entirely confusing after we get through the material here. So we're going to be talking about performance evaluations, everybody's favorite subject. It's that time of year again. It'll be coming up this summer. We wanted to go through, there's a whole article in the contract that's dedicated to employee performance, right? We have certain rights under that provision. We wanted to review those, talk about best strategies in terms of what to do when you get an evaluation that you don't necessarily agree with or you think is not reflective of your performance or your work product. what can you do, right? So we're going to talk about that today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about what evaluations are, right? The first thing I like to tell people is it's entirely subjective, right? With that being said, if if a manager gives you just a really bad evaluation, first thing to do is take a deep breath and remember that is a subjective evaluation, a subjective opinion on your work, right? Don't let it get you too devastated or make you lose sleep at night, because if you do that, you're giving over too much power to your manager in terms of how they make you feel. Certainly, I think the best assessment of your work is your own assessment, right? You know what you do, you know what you do well, you know what you need to improve on. And so, don't let it destroy you, should I say that. I've met a lot of people that they get a bad evaluation and their whole month is like in turmoil. It does have the potential to affect an IRP request if you're requesting the IRP based on merit. What's an IRP? Basically, it's you asking for a raise. I mentioned the range system that we have. It is possible to move through your range, and that is done primarily through the IRP, in-range progression, right? In the contract, there's a process. Your manager can initiate that, or you can initiate that. If you initiate that, and there's like 7 different criteria you can use. You say, I've just been getting more work. I'm doing more skilled work. I'm taking on lead responsibilities. Or I've just been doing a really good job. A bad evaluation could kind of blow apart your argument there, right? With that being said, they do not affect your general salary increase, the GSI, the raise that we negotiate in the contract, which comes on July 1, right? There's no prorating of that raise based on the evaluation. There's no merit raises, which is also exactly why there are no merit raises, because it's a subjective analysis, right? So when there are merit raises, we tend to see favoritism playing out in more than just how people are treated, but how they're paid, right? So we make sure that your evaluation is not really tied, or not tied at all, to your general salary increase. After they are given to you and they're gone through, and we go through the process, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, they do become part of your personnel file. And they are an evaluation of your work as described in your position description. I know some people at CSU start working under a certain job description, and over the years their job changes, and their position description is outdated. If that's the case, that should be updated. But this is in the contract primarily because if you are a certain classification and they are, when it comes time to evaluation, they're judging you on maybe the standards in a higher skill classification or a different classification, it's completely unfair and inappropriate for you to be evaluated on anything other than what's in your own file, what your job is, right? What evaluations are not? Number one, it's not discipline, although sometimes it can feel like discipline, right? If your manager beats you up in an evaluation, feels like you're getting your hand slapped, or I've had some people get bad evaluations and they're just like, oh my God, I feel like I'm going to be fired tomorrow, right? In the contract, it states that discipline, it should be separate from evaluations, right? So if your manager has an issue with you not ever coming to work, or always coming late, or not performing, taking too long of breaks, or just not doing your job, watching YouTube when you're supposed to be crunching numbers, that is to be dealt with outside of the evaluation process, right? And if they talk to you and you continue to do it, maybe you're going to get a reprimand, right? And if you continue to do it, maybe they'll suspend you for a day, right? But the evaluation is not to be used as a step in the disciplinary process. And opposite of subjective, they are not objective, right? A lot of employees notice that it's not objective when they have a change in managers, right? They've worked under a manager for 2 years doing the same work that they're doing now, but the new manager comes in and evaluates and it's just drastically different, right? Again, don't give them too much power in terms of making you feel a certain way about your work or your performance. When do they get done? Well, if you look at the contract, it says for permanent employees that it should be done every year. Although I've met people that haven't been evaluated in 10 years. Right? We'll talk about how that affects things a little bit later. If you're a probationary employee, that means you're hired into a permanent position, but you're still on probation. That's the first 12 months of your employment. There are 3 evaluations that happen. 3rd, 6th, and 11th month of your probationary period. The reason why you have so many there is because you need to get feedback in order to survive your 12 months, right? If there wasn't in there and they never talked to you and they never told you what you need to improve to really make it in the job, and on the 11th month and the 29th day they say, sorry, we're not gonna keep you on. That's unfair, right? Because they never told you what was right, what was wrong. So they got to tell you what's going on. Probationary employees don't have just cause protection. Permanent employees have what's called just cause protection, right? That means you cannot be disciplined or terminated without cause, right? Different than a non-union environment. Non-union environment, you can be fired for anything or nothing at all, as long as they don't overtly, in an approvable way, fire you because of your race, your sex, your gender, your religion, or your age, right? Union environment, they have to have a reason, right? Say you stole something, right? Theft. That's terminable, right? If they can prove it, they're going to move to terminate. If you're a probationary employee, you're back in what's basically a non-union environment somewhat, right? During the first 12 months, if someone's let go, we as the union have very limited recourse to be able to get that person a fair shake. One of the things that will get a person back to work is if we can show that they were never evaluated on their 3rd, 6th, or 11th month, right? So if the person's in month 11, they never got evaluations, and they get a letter saying, you're not making it, see you later, we can get that person back to work, essentially, because they failed to follow the evaluation procedure. Temporary employees. Now, in the old language, this said shall be evaluated at periodic intervals. Who the heck knows what that means? The newly negotiated contract says that they should be evaluated at least annually. So, a little bit more definition. This year, HR has put out to all the managers, they want evaluations completed by the end of July. And that covers essentially the fiscal year 27-2018 period. Has anybody gotten a draft evaluation yet? No? Okay. Who is supposed to evaluate you? Evaluator can be an administrator, an MPP, manager, supervisor, or a lead, right? This is sometimes problematic because a lead, most of the time, is your fellow union member, right? They don't have the authority to hire you, fire you, or discipline you. So sometimes the relationship there is a little gray, and there's actually some contract language, new contract language that we'll hit on in the next few slides to discuss that distinction of a lead versus a manager, right? Usually leads are doing evaluations or having input into evaluations in larger departments where the MPP or the administrator, there's much more separation between their world and the employee's world, right? San Francisco State, there's something like 120 custodians, and the one director there couldn't possibly know the work habits and the performance of every custodian, so they rely on leads and coordinators. Right? In terms of the person evaluating, whoever it is, they should be familiar with your regular work duties and what you do and how you perform. Right? That is to say, if you're supposed to receive your evaluation on at the end of July, and you get a brand new manager on July 1st, that person's not familiar and should not be having input into your evaluation. Unless they really love you and they're going to give you a good evaluation. You don't raise it as an issue. This kind of goes back to your position description, what I talked about before. What should the evaluation include? If in the last year, the period that you're being evaluated on, you were reclassified, or you had a lateral movement, or you took on new work, different type of work, or more work, you really want to push to get that into your evaluation. Because maybe you weren't reclassified during that period, but if you got it in writing, that's going to help your argument in terms of pushing for, well, a couple of things. One, it could, if you're requesting an IRP based on some of those factors that we mentioned before, more work, more skilled work, it's documented, right? Manager can't deny it later and say, oh, well, yeah, I don't know. It also could give justification for reclassification, right? If you're over time taking on more and more duties that are of a higher classification, you've got it in writing, you've got it, some evidence to back up your claim. In your self-evaluation, right? Sean just mentioned that they were given forms to do a self-evaluation. I'm going to have Diego in a little bit talk about his experience with self-evals. I know of some departments at some universities where the manager's so lazy, they say, hey, guys, here, you do your self-evaluation, people fill it out, they return it back in. Next thing they know, that's their evaluation. Right? That would be lovely. Perfect scores for everyone. What should not be in your evaluation? Number one, surprises. Right? Managers are trained at the CSU that your evaluation, if there's things that they're dinging you on, they really should have been having conversations with you throughout the year about those issues, right? So if you're not putting cover sheets on your TPS reports, they should tell you that, right? And ask you to do that, right? And if you continue not to do the TPS report correctly, it's going to end up in your evaluation. But in no case should you have been doing it all year. They never said anything to you. They never told you that there was a problem. And then come evaluation time, you get your evaluation, and it says, "Hey, you didn't do this. We're going to dock your score. We're going to criticize you for it." Right? That should not be happening. And again, in terms of discipline, there should be no reference to discipline within the evaluation document itself. Right? In terms of providing input, some departments, they do the self-evaluation form. Some do not. If they do not, we still have a way to get our own input into our own evaluations in there, because when you're, this has changed a little bit. The old language said your evaluator. Like I said, that could have been anybody, a lead, a supervisor, a manager. Now the contract says it has to be your administrator, right? You're basically your MPP, your manager. They have to come to you and give you your evaluation. Now, if you ever had the situation where your boss comes and said, "Here's your evaluation, sign it, it's all done," that's a violation of the contract, right? There are no final evals until the employee has reviewed it, and if they so choose, to exercise their right to have an input meeting and have a discussion and to challenge it, right? You used to get 5 days to review it, and then an additional 5 you've requested. Now the new contract language just says the first time you see your evaluation, it should be a draft. It's given to you. Take a look at it, review it, and then you can choose your option. Beth?
So, I guess my question lies in I never have contact with my MPP. I only have contact with my first line supervisor. He's the one that gives me the evaluation.
Uh-huh.
Should I take note of that, or should I, like, is he qualified to give it to me to review? And then if I have problems with the draft itself, then I go to the MPP, or should my MPP be handing me?
Is your frontline supervisor an actual supervisor or a union
He's a faculty member.
faculty?
It's the department chair.
Yeah, so he's.
But the department chair doesn't have the authority to do managerial things to you, approve your time off, write you up, fire
he
you.
does all of that. But he's a faculty member.
A department chair has the ability to, they approve the time,
Uh-huh.
and they approve the absences, and they do our evaluation.
Okay.
The
So that, under that definition, the new contract had, they crossed out evaluator and they put in administrator, which makes it clear that person who has managerial duties and authority should be the one having that interaction with you. So if it's not the NPP and it's that person, I don't know if I would make a big deal out of it. Right.
Once the department chair's finished the evaluation, it has to go to the NPP for review and processing from there.
Right.
But our director,
They never meet with us.
our director, no, they don't.
Okay.
So they give you the form, and you look it over. You got 10 days to look it over. If it looks appropriate, if it's good and you agree with it, just put your signature on it, give it back to that person and say, "I'm all right," right? It's over, it's done. Good job. If you look at it and you think, "Wow, this is kind of unfair," or "There's this section in here I don't think really represents the work that I did," or "It's entirely unfair, it's a smear job," then you've got 10 days to say, "Hey, I want to talk about this," right? Now, in the old contract, it said you had to contact the evaluator, and just you and the evaluator sat down, and if that person didn't change their mind or agree to amend the evaluation, then you could escalate it and have another meeting with the evaluator and the administrator and bring your union rep as well. Now it just says we'll skip that first meeting. We'll have one meeting with all the people in the room, and you have a chance to explain why you disagree, why you think something should be changed, why something is not fair, right, and have that discussion. And only after that meeting and after your input has been received does the draft now become a final version, right? So what happens if you disagree? We'll kind of cover that a little bit. The most important thing to remember is if your evaluation sucks, you can't file a grievance. Right? You could potentially grieve that you never got an evaluation, right? Because that's a violation. So they have to give you one. But it doesn't say they have to give you a good one. And it really doesn't even say that they have to give you a fair one, right? So that's just to say, if you receive an evaluation that you think is entirely unfair, we can't go to Article 7 and file a grievance and say, hey, this is a violation of the contract, right? We have to use this process of having the input meeting and having that sit down with the administrator. So like I said, the points 2 and 3 there, that's been merged into one in the new contract language. So you have the 10 days. Within those 10 days, you request that meeting. They have to set it up within 7 days after that. You have that meeting. And a lot of times we are successful in when really things are truly unfair and not representative of your work, and we can demonstrate that. We have been successful in getting some quite a few evals amended, right, to be more reflective. You know, it doesn't turn into, you know, a bad evaluation doesn't turn into an amazing evaluation, but we were able to change it and to correct some things. If we're still not satisfied, say we have that input meeting, and then management comes back and say, nope, we're not going to change a thing. We remain unconvinced. Then our last recourse there is to submit a rebuttal, right? The good thing about the rebuttal is it just, you know, not given to the manager. They look at it and goes into the trash. It actually becomes part of the official record. It becomes an attachment to that evaluation when it goes into your personnel file, right? So that it's not just the manager's version that's sitting there in your file. It's their version plus your counter version or your rebuttal. So at East Bay, you know, all universities, all campuses do things a little differently. I know at San Francisco for many years, like I said, there were people that never got evaluated. They went 10 years without an evaluation. And then they got a new president, and the president really made it a priority. In fact, he made the statement that if he could, legally, he would withhold pay from all MPPs that did not give an evaluation, a timely evaluation to the employees. Right? So the frequency and the consistency of evaluations increased. I know East Bay, they are also doing a campus-wide effort to make sure everybody's getting evaluated. Within the CSU, they've been on this program to make evaluations more meaningful. Now, a word about this. I don't know if anybody's ever gotten an evaluation. I know that Unit 5 has seen this quite a bit. They receive an evaluation and they compare it to last year's, and the words are almost identical. The manager figured out how to use the cut and paste function on the computer program, and they just dropped it into the new one, right? Again, it's not grievable, but if we were to do an input meeting and pointed that out, you could really kind of embarrass a manager, right? Say, you know, if they're criticizing you for your work and maybe making the implication that they're, you know, you're not as motivated as you should be, or you're not doing, having a quality product. Well, let's look at your product, right? This is a duplication of last year's evaluation. Did you really think about it? You know, they're supposed to be meaningful. If you want to get that kind of confrontational, we can. There's this thing been floating around the CSU in terms of what they want to see in the evaluations, and they have this acronym SMART. Stands for, when they give you an evaluation, part of it is, okay, this is how you did, but here are ways that you can really do better next year, right? It's a tool rather than just a description of what happened in the past. So you may see this popping up where they say, okay, we're going to set some goals for you. Under this acronym, the goals should be specific. You should be able to measure them, right? I've actually seen in some evaluations, you need to be more personable in your encounters with Is that measurable? I don't know. Maybe if that was in Don's evaluation, it would fail to be realistic. But they got to have some tips or some suggestions, some goals to be in there. So what happens if July comes and goes and your evaluation is never received? What do you do? I would say the answer to that depends on your relationship with your manager or your evaluator. If your manager hates you and you hate your manager and your relationship is not so good, I would not be banging down the door to try to get an evaluation from that manager. Simply because going forward and looking back at your personnel file, the absence of evaluation can only mean one thing, and this is what we argue when we're before the state personnel board in terms of disciplinary hearings, and there's no personnel, there's no evaluation in the personnel file. We make the argument that's at least meets expectations or at least satisfactory, because if the employer ever had a problem with your performance and they failed to evaluate you, their argument is nil, right? It's gone. If they failed to evaluate you, that must have meant there was nothing bad about you to document or to point out, and that you were doing your job. There was nothing that rose to the level of showing you that you needed to improve, right?
So on AB 1231, it says all represented employees will receive an annual salary step based on satisfactory performance evaluation. So would absence count as satisfactory?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you repeat that question?
So that Claudia
Sentence.
was being very diligent in looking at the flyer on AB 1231. That's the step bill that I was talking about. Remember the very first of the presentation I said we don't have merit increases, right? There is language, and it's common across all the other state employers that have steps, is that if you are failing to perform your job and therefore received a does not meet expectations, that you shouldn't get the step increase, right? So that's a hypothetical situation. If steps pass, and we're going to deal with that, and some people say, well, maybe they just all flunk us now in our evals to avoid giving us a raise, right? Well, that would be a pretty substantial unfair labor practice charge we could file, because if we showed massive movement across the CSU system to downgrade evaluations to avoid legislation, right, we got them. But as Claudia was asking, if there's no eval, right, you're going to get the raise because they didn't document that you were less than satisfactory. If you have a great relationship with your manager and they're always praising you and everything's great, then I would really press them to, if they don't get around to evaluating you, to ask them to please do an evaluation. Or if they're just so busy, ask them if you can do your own evaluation and submit it to them, and then they can put it in there as your eval. So speaking of evaluating yourself, I want to have Diego talk a little bit about self-evals and his experience with those and how those have been done. How are we doing on time?
12:42.
42, okay. Yes, is there a question, Monica?
I have a quick question. What constitutes, what is it, satisfactory? What if you have 2s and 4s? Is it just average it out and it's 3 and that's it?
Right, so an evaluation, is, I'm sure you all know, is broken down in different categories. So each category is given a score, and in our system, it's different than San Francisco, for example. Our system, if you get 1, 2, or 3, those are the top ranking scores. If you start getting below that or above that, then there are problems. So I think 3 is meets expectations, and then a 2 and a 1 are even better scores. And then when you start like with a 4, or if you get a 5, then you're in trouble, and then you should really contact your union steward. So does that help you? Does that answer your question?
For the question, I guess I'm thinking it more in terms of college students. Is it you average it out, or is it it's 3s and then maybe 1 4 and that brings it down?
Okay, and then that is, we haven't really made calculations to make sure that all the scores average out to your final score for an evaluation. But basically, it does coincide. It does represent the essence of the evaluation. So if you are a good employee, you're meeting expectations, the overall rating should be meets expectations. And that hasn't really been a problem, but it's a good question. Thank you, Monica. Okay, so because we're short on time and I want to make sure we have time for questions, I want to just focus on preparing a self-evaluation. I really support self-evaluations. On the HR website, the form actually exists there, and it's called a self-appraisal form. The reason why I like the self-appraisal form is because that's you appraising yourself, advising your manager about your performance. Not only your performance, but goals that you want to set for yourself. Say your manager's not sure about what you do. This is the perfect opportunity to build yourself up. And not falsely, but tell them exactly what you're doing, how you're contributing to your department, to the university, how well you're doing, where you want to go, what training you want, what classes you want to take. It's a good opportunity to have that presented to your manager before the draft is presented to you. Okay, that's key. So if you know your evaluation is scheduled, it's inevitable, it's going to happen, it's a good time to consider filling out that self-eval, that self-appraisal form. That way you can give it to him, you get your draft, he reviews your self-evaluation, then that opens an opportunity, an automatic meeting, follow-up meeting, so that you guys can discuss both, right? Say the evaluation from your manager is covering all the items that you want to cover in your self-appraisal, then that's a match, and you guys can go on and sign that, and everybody will be happy. But that self-appraisal gets filed with your, it gets put in your personnel file. So I really like the opportunity that self-appraisal form gives all the staff to fill out. So I encourage you all to, if you know that an evaluation is inevitable, and you know what time you're going to meet with your manager, have that prepared. Because again, that's you communicating to your manager how well you're doing. Any questions on that? Okay. So at this point, Nick, do you want to entertain any questions?
Sure.
Okay.
We got, what, 10 minutes left?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this is the last slide. Yes. So in terms of challenging or trying to improve the evaluation that's been given to you, and the union's help, I just want to review that. So the first thing to remember is that we can't file a grievance on a bad eval, right? We could file a grievance on no eval if we really wanted to push it, right? Or we could file a grievance, like I said, on that probationary employee. We can use the absence of the eval to show that they can't let that person go because they never give them input. We can't file the grievance, but we can affect the final draft of the eval, right? That can be done through some of the steps listed here in terms of preparing, providing, as Diego said, providing a self-evaluation prior to them. That you give them kind of a blueprint. You may even remind them of things that you did 10 months ago that maybe they forgot about. I remember when I took on that special project and I really excelled, and that kind of reminds them of your achievements throughout the year. But we can help in terms of going with you to that input meeting. If you would want one of the stewards to go with you, might give Diego an email and say, hey, I got an eval that I want to challenge a little bit, and I want to have this input meeting like the contract says. Can you come, or can you have one of the stewards come to the meeting? And we've also assisted folks in terms of writing, helping to write rebuttals to the evaluation. And then sometimes people have questions about, evaluation sometimes can trigger conversations about the person's classification, if they're classified correctly. Maybe they're working out of class, or they have been working out of class for the past year. Those are all, certainly union issues that we try to keep an eye on, because we want to avoid the scenario where people are being taken advantage of, saying they're doing kind of, expert level work when they're a career classification, or they're doing, buyer 2, buyer 3 skills and duties when they're classified as a buyer 2, right? So those kind of things tend to come out during the evaluation period, and that's actually a lot of times when we catch some of these inconsistencies and misclassifications, that we can work on those to get those addressed as well. So hopefully you found some of this information helpful. I do think our last negotiations has improved and cleaned up this language. I think it was kind of not pointless, but a little too cumbersome to have 2 meetings. Or first you meet with the evaluator, and if you don't get anywhere, then have to meet with the administrator and the evaluator. Because a lot of times the evaluator and the administrator were the same person anyway, right? It's one of the contract language. It's like you could technically have 2 meetings with the same guy or the same woman. I think it's much cleaner now and much better. So any questions on this, or on AB 1231, or the membership renewal, Monica?
Yeah, quick question actually. I had, there was a situation where somebody had something, again, it was a ding for something that he hadn't known that he was supposed to do. And so I had him go directly to the boss. Should he actually have done it, or have gone through the union and done it that way? What happened was, when he went directly to the boss, and I told him to let him know, in our contract language, it gave him our contract language, that if he's never been told about it, it has to be totally stricken. And so it was immediately stricken right then and there.
Good.
So that's good enough, so people can do that actually if they see something that's, no surprises.
Right.
That's it.
Right.
Okay, all right,
Good.
you can do now.
Yes.
I had a question about when you write your own self-evaluation. So like in the last year, I went for an IRP, and in the IRP, I revised my job description. That's what they kind of asked me to do. And so to include my new duties or the new level that I was working at. And anyways, long story short, I got denied the IRP, but they asked me to sign that my new job description was going to be my job description now. So would I point that out in my performance?
We want to revisit that denial, because it sounds like they gave you a lot of license to sort of like create your own job. So if you're creating your own job description or updating it so that it warrants an IRP and increase in pay, what you want to compare those new duties with is the criteria in the article, in the IRP article. And that is any kind of new duties or responsibilities, any new skills that you've obtained because of training. So follow the criteria, and if it falls under that, we can go back and revisit that. Because they basically are saying, okay, well, your job duties are going to change, and say it's sort of like encroaches into another classification, then you want to open that door for dialogue, and you want to have a representative with you to see if they can remake that argument. Like, hey, if it's the criteria for an RP for these reasons, but not only that, it's like most of these new duties carry over, and they're more than 50% of a new classification. So let's forget about the IRP, let's go for a reclass.
And my question
Now-
is now, like, my job description is completely different now because it encompasses all my duties that I said I had absorbed. Do you see what I'm saying?
So
like,
workload is one of the criteria.
yeah, so I'm
for
just
an
wondering,
RFP.
do I speak to that in my job in my performance appraisal?
Why don't we talk about that? Why don't you meet with the union reps so that we can review what those duties are?
And I have a little concern about that because a lot of times the IRP denials, they recognize that you are doing some more
That was what
work,
They said they recognized it and they wanted to
but
redo
not
my
quite
job
enough,
Yeah.
right? But then throughout the next year, if you add some, and they're
Yeah.
they're going off of the revised description, it's not going to reflect the amount of change,
Right, exactly.
right,
That's my
over
point,
time.
yeah.
So yeah, let's talk after the meeting. Just a word on that. You know, I used to be a gardener at University of Minnesota, so I try to talk to about things in kind of those terms I understand. I don't know anything about IT or a lot of office work. So I to give an example. If you, in terms of an IRP, new work, different work, right? Say my job last year was planting flowers, and then this year they come and they say, we're not going to have you plant flowers anymore. We're going to have you plant shrubs, right? Not a lot of justification for an IRP based on just new work, right? And it is new work, but it's not more work because I'm not doing the flowers anymore. I'm just doing the shrubs, right? It's a different story if the new year comes and I say, okay, in addition to the flowers, you are going to plant shrubs, right? Then it becomes, right, it's a question of volume, right, rather than just the difference in the type of work. Or I was planting flowers, and then this year they say we're going to have you plant more flowers, but these flowers require special care. You have more fertilizer. You're going to have to go out and get an applicator license in terms of pesticide because they're very sensitive, right? So the skill level is increasing, right? So that's a justification. So it all kind of depends on, when people say, oh, my job has changed. If it's just flower or shrubs now instead of flowers, it may not be enough to get you that jump in the IRP. But maybe if it is flowers and shrubs or a special kind of flower, right? Then there's the justification. But evaluation-wise, if last year you were evaluated on planting flowers, and now this year you're planting only shrubs, the evaluation should be based on the work that you did, right? So there should be no references to flowers, just shrubs in that next year's evaluation.
I had a quick question. I got a good evaluation, the best I've had in 10 years. I don't think it was ever completed or turned in. Who would I ask to find out if it was ever completed or turned in? Because the thing that was left hanging for months was trying to update the job description to match the comments in the evaluation, like a new description is attached. For me, this has been chasing a moving target. I will have had 5 different bosses in 10 years, pretty soon. And so the evaluation keeps getting delayed into fall and rolling forward till I'm under someone else. And there goes my IRP opportunity window and so forth. So you know the broken pieces of the IRP process, but in spite of the fact that they said they would be supportive of a classification upgrade? Not a change in classification. The attachment of revising the job description to match what I was doing never got completed. So what would you suggest? Do I go back to the manager and see, hey, could we finish that before we do this year's? Or do I go to HR or my rep, or who would I go to?
Yeah, so in terms of to check to see if anything ever made it in your file, you do have the right to inspect your file at any time, right? So, who's the lady you call?
It's Wendy.
Wendy. You make an appointment.
Yeah.
She's usually pretty like most people can get sometimes that day or that week, and they bring you in and they show you your file and you can comb through it and you can look at your whole file, including evals, your hire letters, your any changes, classification changes, schedule changes. It's all in there, right? So you can do that and look, and if it's not in there, then I would suggest going back to the manager and saying, hey, last year's evaluation was really great, and I want to make sure it gets in my record. Right?
So, is it correct that only the last 3 years' evals should be in your personnel folder?
No, they should contain everything.
Really?
That's
Yeah.
not correct.
And has anybody ever went and double checked to see if their file has them in
I
it? Or
have.
some have left, come up missing?
That's your right, and the responsibility of this, it's our responsibility to make sure all that's in there. And you're given that right to do it. So I would encourage you, if there's any doubt, go check. You got a question?
Yeah, so let's say you've been reclassed or changed jobs on campus. My understanding is you start a new one-year probationary period. So during that period, then, do you lose your just cause rights? Or can a bad evaluation sort of sink your employment entirely because you are probationary, even though maybe you've worked on campus for 5 years?
Good question.
Yep. So the new probationary period depends, right? Sometimes they waive it, sometimes they apply it, but you also have retreat rights.
Yep.
Okay.
So if someone gets a new job and transfers into another department, and they didn't know their boss was such an a-hole, and life is hell, they can actually retreat back to the
And if
to the
your
old
old
position.
job has been filled, you still have retreat rights?
Yeah, not necessarily to the same job, but a similar job, right? Because they could have filled it in that time. We actually had a guy who was wanting to change jobs, and he was hating life so much that he was willing to take a temporary position, and the department that posted the temporary position was very nervous about hiring him because even if the temporary appointment ended, he was still a permanent employee, and if they didn't have something for him, he had to have a job somewhere, right? So HR got involved, like, oh, we're gonna have to create a job for him at some point at the end of the 12 months if you're not gonna have the funds to hire him. And, so you do have the rights to, if it's not working out, to retreat back to the old classification.
Any other questions? Yes.
This is piggybacking on his question. So the probation period applies to the reclassification or to the new job position?
Both.
New job. If you are reclassified, let's say you're over time, you're taking classes, you're getting certifications, and you're doing higher level work, right? If you get reclassified, most of the time there's no temporary position, probationary period, right? If you are working at your job and then you see a posting for another department, right, in another position, different classification in another department, and you put in an application, and you go through the interview process, and there's an interview panel, and then you get chosen, that's where the new probationary position may be implemented. But again, you have the retreat rights if it doesn't work out.
And HR should know that, right?
Yeah,
Okay, just curious. 'Cause
they should.
we've gone through probationary periods for free classes.
Oh, really?
I'm doing that right now. They granted my IRP, which was also a reclass, I guess. But essentially, my job description was changed to reflect the job I was already doing. And when that all changed, and I got, essentially the job description had been classified incorrectly when they had created it. And now that it's correct, they're making me go through a 1-year probationary.
Yeah, we should actually talk about that because
Yeah.
when that happens, most of the time, the classification is catching up to the work that you've already been doing. So our argument is, the probationary period has already been served, right? Because you're doing that job anyway. We're just reclassifying to catch up to the progress that you made or the way that your job has evolved over time.
So that means they would not go, they would have that 1-year probation again, start over?
They shouldn't.
They should not.
They should not.
Can you, negotiate if somebody, if you know, go into another position and, you know, it is legitimate, and that they're saying you have to go through a probationary period, can you, say, well, I've gone through lots of probationary periods before, can we make this one 6 months or 3 months and provide justification? And, I mean, you could throw that out there, and is that, you know, would they go for that, or?
You can make any suggestion that you want. However, that situation, the waiving of the probationary period is contingent upon the president's approval or the president's designee, which most of the time is Andre Johnson, right? So it's not like you
Salary negotiation like that, yeah,
you don't have a ton of leverage because it's there. It can be a
way up there.
unilateral decision.
Quick question on I think I saw some language about, if the rebuttal isn't in your file, you can add back to a past situation, like when I went looking in my folder, the rebuttal was not attached to my evaluation. Do I have a right? Is it a requirement for them to attach it, or can they just throw the rebuttal away because it pointed out managerial errors? And I don't know if I want to go back in the past and try to revamp some. These three managers are all gone now. Like, what's the point?
So
But it's not
it is a
correct.
requirement.
The
They have to put it in.
allegations writing are incorrect.
They do have to include a rebuttal. It's part of their, you file a grievance on it. But also, interestingly, there's no deadline or timeline. So, a lot of times they'll file a grievance. You have 30 days to file a grievance, and then, when you get a response back, you have 14 days to file a step 2 or whatever. There's no deadline on the rebuttal. So potentially you could kind of take your time and really think about it and submit your rebuttal 2 months later or 2 years later.
But you're saying I don't have to file a grievance to keep my rebuttal rights open, that 5 or 6 years ago, the evaluation was inaccurate and my rebuttal is missing. So do you think I should go back that far or just forget about it? Because I think now that these managers are no longer here, all three of them, with language that kept repeating, like you said, the cut and paste language of what's wrong with this person, I don't really want to revisit it. I don't see the point.
Right.
And
So
I would agree with
appreciate
you.
it.
Yeah,
Because
I
it
would
wouldn't do
agree.
me any good, right? It's not gonna do anybody any good.
I would agree.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for coming.